Part 1. A Girl Alone. I'll never forget the first moment I understood that the world was not going to hand anything to me for free. It was my 16th birthday. I was sitting cross-legged on the floor in the corner of my bedroom, reading a medical journal I picked up a couple of weeks ago. The pages were yellowed and the book's cover was torn, but the words inside captivated me. On that particular day, something within me shattered, and something entirely new within me began. Until that point, I always had faith in the hope that a kind stranger would come to rescue me, perhaps a distant relative, or even my guiding aunt who opened her doors to me after my parents departed from my life. She never really paid attention to me. When I was 12, she told me, "Don't expect too much from life. You're not special, you're just unlucky." I carried those words like stones in my chest for years. I didn't cry, though, not even once. You learn quickly in the orphanage. Tears are wasted water. Growing up there, surrounded by other kids with empty eyes and broken hearts, I learned a few things fast. First, no one is coming. Second, if you want anything, even a little bit of safety or hope, you have to take it. And third, the world is not kind to quiet girls with big dreams. I was always the quiet one, the skinny girl who didn't talk much, who read too much, who kept to herself. Some people said I was too serious. Others said I was strange, but no one ever said I was brave, or smart, or strong. Still, that day in the library, reading about a surgeon who saved a child's life in the middle of a war zone, something cracked open inside me. He didn't just survive. He saved lives. He gave people hope. I wanted that. I didn't just want to live. I wanted to matter. That was the moment I made a promise to myself. I would become a doctor, not because I believed I could, but because I had to. Because if I didn't fight for something, then all the pain, all the silence, all the loneliness, it would mean nothing. I didn't have money. I didn't have a family. I didn't even have a real home. But I had something stronger. I had a reason. From that day on, I changed. I started waking up earlier than everyone else. At 5 in the morning, I'd sneak into the study room where no one ever went and read anything I could find. Biology textbooks, old anatomy guides. Sometimes I didn't even understand the words, but I'd write them down and look them up later. I cleaned floors at the grocery store after school. I served tea at a dusty roadside cafe on weekends. Every coin I earned went into a jar I kept under my bed, my dream jar. It wasn't much, but it was mine. At night, when the other girls in the orphanage were asleep, I'd lie in bed and whisper Latin words to myself. Femur, clavicle, aorta, cerebellum. I didn't know if I was saying them right, but I didn't care. They felt like secret keys, doors into a world I wasn't supposed to enter. And then came the clinic. It was a small local place, nothing fancy. Just 3 doctors, 2 nurses, and a line of sick people that never seemed to end. I started volunteering there when I was 17. I told them I'd sweep floors, clean instruments, anything. Just let me be near the work, near the healing. At first they ignored me, treated me like a ghost, but I kept showing up, Every day, quietly watching, listening, learning. One day, Dr. Hayes, a tired man with sharp eyes and a soft heart, asked me why I was always hanging around. "I want to be a doctor," I said, looking straight into his eyes. He laughed, not in a cruel way, just surprised. "You?" he asked. I nodded. "Me." He didn't say anything for a while, just stared at me, like he was trying to see if I was lying. Then he handed me a clipboard. "Start with this," he said. "Learn how we organize patient files." It was a small thing, but to me it felt like he had opened a door. From then on, I stayed longer. I asked questions. I took notes. I watched everything. How they spoke to patients, how they cleaned wounds, how they stayed calm even when things got messy. And slowly something amazing started happening. They stopped seeing me as the quiet orphan girl. They started seeing me as someone who cared, someone who wanted to learn. I still had a long way to go. I didn't even know how I'd pay for college, let alone medical school. But none of that mattered yet. What mattered was that I had found a reason to wake up, a reason to keep going, a light behind the fog. The people in my village still whispered. They still said I was chasing a fantasy, that I was too poor, too alone, too ordinary. But they didn't see what I saw. They didn't feel the fire inside me. A quiet, steady burn that wouldn't go out. I wasn't just going to survive, I was going to become something they never imagined. The Light Behind the Fog, Part 2. The Journey to Becoming. I wasn't sure how I was going to do it. Becoming a doctor wasn't something that people like me did. But every time I picked up a book, every time I helped at the clinic, the more I believed it was possible. The first step was the hardest, finding a way to pay for the education I needed. There were no scholarships for orphans like me, no easy paths, but I didn't stop. I applied for every small grant I could find, and finally, a local charity took pity on me. They agreed to pay for my first year at the medical school in the neighboring city. I remember the day I packed my things. The orphanage was a silent place. The other children had no idea what it felt like to leave. They still had families who visited, people who loved them. But for me, it felt like I was finally escaping the life that had been decided for me. I was taking my future into my own hands, no matter how uncertain it was. The city was overwhelming at first. I wasn't used to crowds, to the constant noise of cars and people rushing past. I felt out of place in the grand lecture halls of the university, surrounded by students who had everything I didn't: families, wealth, connections. But the moment I stepped into the anatomy lab, something clicked. This was where I belonged. Every night I stayed up late, poring over my textbooks, practicing my Latin medical terms, trying to memorize every detail about the human body. I had no room for distractions. I couldn't afford to fail. But even with all the studying, I knew I needed more experience. That's when I started shadowing the doctors at the local clinic. It wasn't glamorous. Most of the time, I cleaned wounds or took down notes. But every time I saw a patient walk out of that clinic a little better, I felt like I was making a difference. The doctors there were kind but busy, and they didn't have time to sit with me and teach me everything I needed to know. But there was one woman, Doctor Emily, who took an interest in me. She was sharp, no nonsense, and incredibly skilled. I would watch her work, her hands moving with precision as she diagnosed and treated patients. There was something about her calm confidence that inspired me. She never made me feel small, despite my lack of experience. Instead, she pushed me to be better, to never stop learning. One day, after a particularly difficult surgery, Dr. Emily sat down next to me and said, "You have what it takes, Eliza. But don't expect the world to make it easy for you. You'll have to work harder than anyone else. Do you think you're ready for that?" I didn't even hesitate. "I'm ready," I said, my voice steady. She nodded, as if she had expected no less. "Good. Then let's get to work." Part 3. The First Challenge. The years passed quickly. By the time I finished my degree, I had already learned more than I could have ever imagined. I had seen death up close, experienced the joy of saving lives, and felt the weight of responsibility on my shoulders. But the real challenge came when I applied for my first real job as a doctor. I had made it this far, but now I had to prove myself. The hospital I applied to was known for its high standards, and I knew the competition would be fierce. I remember walking into the interview room, nervous but determined. The panel of doctors looked at me with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. They asked about my background, my experiences, and my motivation. I answered as best as I could, but deep down, I knew they didn't expect much from someone like me. But then they asked a question that made my heart race. "Why do you want to be a doctor, Eliza? What drives you?" I thought for a moment, and then I spoke the truth. "Because I know what it's like to be forgotten. I know what it's like to have no one, and I want to make sure that no one else has to feel that way. I want to give people the care they deserve, no matter who they are." There was a pause, and for a moment I wondered if I had said too much. But then one of the doctors nodded. "That's the right reason. We need more doctors like you." A few days later, I got the call. I had been accepted. The Light Behind the Fog. Part 4. A New Beginning. The first time I walked into the hospital wearing that white coat, I froze. Not out of fear, though I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared, but because it didn't feel real. I stood just inside the entrance, the automatic doors sliding shut behind me, the steady hum of footsteps and voices filling the air. I looked down at the name badge clipped to my coat. Doctor, Akan, Doctor. After everything, the loneliness, the doubt, the nights spent reading by flashlight under worn blankets, the rejection letters, the hunger, the heartbreak. I had made it. And yet, in that moment, I didn't feel powerful. I felt small, like the 16-year-old girl back in the library, clutching a torn medical journal, daring to believe in something she couldn't see. But then I heard my name called over the intercom. And I moved, because this wasn't a dream anymore. This was my life. My first patient was a middle-aged woman with chest pain. She looked scared, vulnerable, and for a moment, I wondered if I could really help her. Could I carry the weight of someone else's hope? I took a breath, sat beside her, held her hand. And as I spoke, calmly, gently, I saw something shift in her eyes. Trust. That's when I knew this is where I belong. It wasn't glamorous. The hours were long. Some nights I didn't sleep at all. There were emergencies that shattered me, and losses that left bruises no one could see. I stood beside seasoned doctors, men and women who had decades of experience, who had seen everything from gunshot wounds to mothers giving birth in hallways during blackouts. I listened. I learned. I absorbed everything they taught me, not just the science, but the humanity. And every time I made a diagnosis, comforted a child, or stitched up a wound, I felt a quiet, unshakable truth growing inside me. I was meant to be here, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't question myself sometimes. There were nights I sat alone in the on-call room, staring at the wall, wondering if I was strong enough. If I belonged among people who came from respected families, with fancy degrees, whose parents called them after every shift just to say, "I'm proud of you." I didn't have those phone calls. There was no one waiting up for me. No warm, home-cooked meal after a long shift. No voice on the other end of the line telling me I was doing a good job. Just silence. And yet, I kept going. Because every time I walked into a patient's room, I saw something familiar in their eyes: fear, uncertainty, hope. And I realized I wasn't alone. They needed me, not just for prescriptions and treatments, but for presence, for compassion, for someone to look them in the eyes and say, "I see you. I care." And every time I did that, I felt that quiet fire inside me burn a little brighter. I remembered where I came from, the quiet girl no one believed in, the orphan who was too quiet, too weak, too poor to make anything of herself. And then I looked around, the hospital walls, the patients, the team that now called me doctor. This was real. I wasn't dreaming. I was living the very life I once believed was impossible. And I had earned every step of it. Not because someone gave it to me, but because I refused to give up. This life, with its exhaustion and heartbreak and joy and meaning, was mine. Built with my own hands, brick by brick, tear by tear, victory by victory. I didn't just survive. I became the person I needed when I was a child. And now, I get to be that person for someone else. The light behind the fog. Part 5. The struggle. Years passed, and as I settled into my role at the hospital, the weight of responsibility grew heavier. Being a doctor wasn't just about healing bodies. It was about bearing witness to the struggles of others, to their pain, their fears, and sometimes their losses. It was hard, harder than anything I had ever imagined. There were days when I wanted to quit, days when I felt like I was drowning under the pressure. The long hours, the constant stream of patients, the never-ending decisions to be made. It wore me down. But there was always something that kept me going, the thought of where I had come from. I remembered the orphanage, the cold, empty hallways, the days spent alone. I remembered the library, the books that had been my escape, my hope. And I remembered Dr. Emily, who had pushed me when I wanted to give up, who had believed in me when no one else did. On those days when I felt overwhelmed, I would think of her words. You'll have to work harder than anyone else. And so I did. I worked until my hands ached, until my body was exhausted, and even then I kept going, because I knew there was no other option. I had come too far to stop now, but life has a way of testing your resolve. One day, after a particularly exhausting shift, I received a call that shook me to my core. My aunt, Margaret, the woman who had raised me, if you could call it that, had fallen ill. It was sudden, unexpected, and the doctors were unsure if she would survive. I hadn't seen Aunt Margaret in years. She had always been distant, even cruel, but in that moment, all I could think about was what she had done for me when I was younger. She had taken me in when I had no one else, even if she had never been the warmest of guardians. And now she was lying in a hospital bed, and I was the one who had to help her. I rushed to the hospital where she was being treated, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to expect, what I could do for her, but I knew I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. I entered her room, and for the first time in years, I saw her eyes soften just a little. "Eliza," she whispered, her voice weak. I never thought you'd become someone like this." I smiled faintly, though my heart ached. "You taught me to survive, Aunt Margaret, and now I'm here to help you." It wasn't easy. Aunt Margaret's condition worsened over the following weeks, but I did everything I could to ease her pain. I stayed by her side, even though she didn't speak much, and in the quiet moments, I realized something. I had forgiven her. The anger I had carried for so long had faded, replaced by the understanding that she had done the best she could with what she had. Eventually, Aunt Margaret passed away. Her death wasn't unexpected, but it was still a loss. In some ways, it felt like the final chapter of my childhood had ended. I had made peace with my past, with the pain and the resentment, and now I was free to move forward. Part 6. The Light Ahead. After Aunt Margaret's death, I took some time off to grieve and reflect. But even in my sorrow, I knew my work wasn't done. There was still so much I wanted to do, so many people I wanted to help. I threw myself back into my work at the hospital, taking on more challenging cases, mentoring younger doctors, and pushing myself further than I ever had before. The hospital became my home, the place where I could make a difference. And I realized something important. I had found my family in the patients I treated, in the colleagues who had become my friends, and in the lives I had touched. As the years went on, I gained respect in the medical community, not because of my background or my education, but because of my passion. I wasn't just a doctor. I was someone who truly cared, who understood what it meant to struggle, to fight, and to overcome. One day, I stood in front of a group of medical students, teaching them the lessons I had learned over the years. They looked up to me, not as a woman from a poor, forgotten village, but as a doctor who had earned her place. And in that moment, I realized that everything I had gone through, the loneliness, the hardships, the doubts, had been worth it. I had found my purpose. I had become the person I had always wanted to be, not because life had given me anything, but because I had taken it. I had forged my own path, and it had led me to a life filled with meaning, with purpose, and with the knowledge that I had made a difference. I had become a doctor, and that, I knew, was just the beginning. The end.